Hi, I'm Dan White, UAF Chancellor. In November 2018, we launched a strategic planning effort for 2025. Our process was organized around 6 goals, focused on who we are and what we aspire to be. These goals included modernizing the student experience, solidifying our global leadership in Alaska Native and Indigenous programs, achieving Tier 1 research status, transforming UAF's IP development and commercialization enterprise, embracing and growing a culture of respect, diversity, inclusion, and caring, and revitalizing key academic programs. For each of these goals, a committee was made up of students, faculty, and staff. And throughout the 2018 to 2019 academic year, these committees met, they gathered input, and they drafted reports. Those reports answered 3 critical questions. Who do we want to become? Who are we now? And how do we get from who we are now to who we want to be? Final reports of the planning committees were published in 2019, back in July. The rollout of the plan had to be put on hold due to organizational uncertainty in the UA system. But the committees were reconvened in the summer of 2020, and the committee chairs were charged with the next steps in the process. This included a presentation on the committee's goal, a 2-page overview, and a 2-minute video. I want to thank the committee chairs for their leadership, all of the committee members for their hard work, and to everyone who contributed input or feedback throughout this process. Between now and the end of the academic year, we seek your input so that these plans can be finalized and published as UAF's Strategic Plan 2025. Thanks for choosing UAF.
Welcome to the forum for goal number 1 in strategic planning, which is modernizing the student experience. My name is Madera Mason, and I'm the Associate Director of Teaching and Learning for eCampus, and the pedagogy representative for the Provost Faculty Development Team. And I'm joined here today by the wonderful Alex Hirsch, and together we're going to cover what's currently happening with this goal during phase 4. Alex, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about sort of what's happened up to this point?
Sure. Well, so I'm Alex Hirsch, as Madera mentions. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Political Science. I'm also the director of the Honors College. And I have been working on modernizing the student experience for a couple of years now. A lot of people have been working on this particular strategic planning initiative for quite a long time. And now we're entering into a concluding phase, which is exciting, and things are starting to roll out. That doesn't mean that things aren't still relatively molten. I think that there's plenty of room here for input. We're seeking input. We want this planning process to be inclusive and integrative of multiple perspectives. The way things started out, the chancellor formed a large committee around each of the strategic planning initiative areas, including modernizing the student experience. And we had a really, really diverse team at the start.
And were you with this all the way from the beginning, Alex? Were you with this all the way from the beginning?
Oh,
wow.
Yes.
Okay.
It's been 2 years in gestation. and yeah, the chancellor came up with a really interesting and creative process in which he gave our committee, the initial committee, the charge of establishing a sense of who do we want to be, so an aspirational vision. But then he also asked us to compare that with who we are now, and then to come up with a set of ideas and action items regarding how we can connect who we are now to who we want to be. And so that's a lot of the first year of the planning process kind of focused on those 3 questions. Who do we want to be? Who are we now? And how do we get to who we want to be, right? How do we get to and otherwise?
Those are not small questions. Those strike me as big questions.
They were big questions. And luckily we were capacitated with a really large dynamic team that included folks from many of the college's faculty representatives, student representatives, staff representatives. We had people from Res Life. We had people from rural campuses. We had people from recreation. We had community members, stakeholders from a lot of different perspectives. And that really contributed to a holistic vision. What we did in our process was we sort of started with who do we want to be? And what we did was we we came up with a set of conclusions regarding what a modern university ought to look like. And we decided that a modern university should be cutting edge, and it should be international, and should be a vital source of critical innovation and student engagement. It should be a leader in the realm of trailblazing research, but it should also be the keystone of a caring and inclusive and well-connected community. And it should be possessive of a vibrant campus life that is diverse. And we sort of came up with that sort of foundational understanding of what a university is or ought to be. And then we allowed that set of values to inform how we moved forward in terms of thinking about UAF more specifically as a place where a modern student experience can take place. So that's, yeah, go ahead.
I mean, it's a healthy process, I think. I mean, having that many stakeholders in the process, I think, means you're going to come up with a vision for change that everyone might be able to sort of stomach, basically, and something that's going to work for more than just one or, you know, a small handful of stakeholders. So I'm coming into this process a little bit late. I mean, of course, I've been aware of the 6 goals for, you know, the last couple of years, and excited to sort of see what was going to come out of this phase. And in looking back over some of the documents, there were a few things that struck me as interesting. And these are things that you and I have had conversations about over the last, sorry about that. These are things that you and I have had conversations about over the last couple of weeks here. And I just sort of want to get us talking about some of these things that I've highlighted here. This idea that what students need to learn, and the reason why we need to modernize, is that students need to be able to actively respond to load-bearing problems. That phrase struck me as really interesting. What does that mean exactly, Alex? Like, what's a load-bearing problem? I can sort of intuit what that means, but you and I have really had some interesting discussions about what that actually means in terms of applying that to the classroom and to the student experience on campus. So what's a load-bearing problem?
Well, so this idea it came out of some student focus groups that we organized over the course of that initial year when we were looking for ways to think about what a modern student experience looks like specifically. And the students talked a lot about how they wanted the learning that they were doing in the classroom to have application in the real world, right? They wanted to feel like they were engaging not just in learning exercises that prioritized passively absorbing information or memorizing information. They didn't just, in other words, want to look back on their education and say, wow, I really picked up a lot of facts along the way. Instead, what they emphasized was just wanting to set ideas in motion in impactful ways. And a lot of students talked in inspiring ways about the communities that they came from, all over Alaska, including rural Alaska, but also all over the country, all over the world. And they talked about their home communities and the kinds of challenges that their communities were facing. And what they'd hoped is that we could modernize the student experience at UAF such that we could make as a kind of student learning outcome goal, rendering students, capacitating students such that they can become change agents for those home communities, which is to say, apply their learning in a way that helps to lift their communities up and actually specifically address some of the things that they were witnessing back home. And so we were inspired by that. And, we integrated that into the vision of what modernizing a student experience looks like, right? Learning exercises, learning spaces, pedagogy should be focused. We decided at a modern university that prioritizes a modern student experience, not just on sort of passively being in a static classroom environment, but also forms bridges to the outside world. And the load bearing part is just what we kept hearing from students was that they wanted to feel like what they were learning really mattered.
Right.
So, that could be different depending upon each student. And therein lies part of the challenge of, coming up with a way to systematically capacitate students depending upon where they're from and depending upon their personal goals. Another challenge that came up is how do we then measure what does it look like for someone to become a change agent over time?
Yeah.
Right.
So
And
this is
an accreditation challenge.
Yeah, and this is actually sort of I think where we start digging into some of the details that I found really interesting too. So, there's this idea that we want to teach students how to solve load-bearing problems. But it's like the child's infinite question of why, right? We can keep sort of drilling down into this thing. And this is sort of the next layer here. I like this idea that what we're really trying to do is empower students to become boundary spanners and change agents. Those are the kinds of phrases that, they sound nice on the surface. And you've got sort of an explication here, the idea that boundary spanners see how traditional fields of knowledge can be integrated and transcended. And that change agents they have the power to set ideas in motion. Those are broad goals. Talk to me a little bit about how, especially the boundary spanners. That's the one that I find most curious. Like, how did we come to that as a thing that we need to be teaching students how to do?
Well,
why is that important?
I think it's important. So this came up a lot, not just in the student focus groups we did, but also talking to community stakeholders, talking to faculty, and talking to staff around campus. This came up over and over and over again. A theme emerged around just people feeling like they're overly siloed on campus, that they're stuck at their particular corner and feel like they don't have enough access to collaborative opportunities and collaborative leadership. And though they wanted to forge transformative change and engage in transformative change, that they found that they were overly isolated. And this had to do with, we thought, in part, it's a facilities question, but also it's a campus culture question. And, what we wanted to do was think about, not just how can faculty and staff become better integrated with one another and find more opportunities to enter into contact zones such that they can find one another and hear about what each other is working on, so that new kind of interdisciplinary research could be performed. But also, how do we tie students into that, right? How do we give students more opportunities to see the ways in which traditional fields of knowledge can be integrated? In many senses, this is something else that came up a lot. The model that of education that UAF is still sort of tethered to is a 19th century model of education in which students are meant to kind of be brought onto campus and then trained or disciplined in a particular field.
Right.
And there's lots and lots of value to that, obviously, right? There's tremendous value in that. But what we heard over and over again is just this kind of interest in finding ways to transcend those patterns and find new kind of pathways and find new interdisciplinary opportunities to see the ways in which, for instance, studying neurochemistry and studying engineering and studying painting actually have lots in common. The more you read Shakespeare, maybe the better you get at building bridges as a civil engineer. And we decided that a modern student experience is one that introduces opportunities for that level of integration, integrative thinking, integrative learning, and the kind of heuristic we came up with for describing that is boundary spanner. Boundary spanner is someone who can see the ways in which traditional fields of knowledge can be integrated, but boundary spanner as a concept is also broader than that. I mean, boundary spanners can be people who are bilingual. Boundary spanners can be people who belong to more than one community, have more than one identity, and can bring people together.
Code switchers.
Exactly. And so we just noticed that this theme was coming up a lot in our conversations of wanting to present students with an opportunity to experiment with boundary spanning themselves, and then wield their boundary spanner identities in a way that will help them to facilitate change. So that's sort of the broad vision.
So that certainly seems super relevant to what is now a very complex world that students are going into, both on, in sort of professional ways, but also in terms of huge, wicked problems like climate change and that sort of thing. I mean, it certainly seems like we still need depth expertise, but we also need the ability to transcend that depth so that we can see the connections between things. So yeah, I think boundary spinners is definitely one of those phrases that I picked up on and started using quite a bit because I think it's really accurate and helpful. So here was another thing that I found interesting in some of the materials that I was going over, the previous documents that you guys had sort of used to drive some of this. There were three big areas, and I think this ended up in the summary document as well. There were these three big areas that came up that are like areas of focus. So cutting edge learning opportunities, environments for holistic student well-being, and a culture of innovation, research, and active learning. So, you guys could have picked just about anything. Why these three things? Like, why did you guys sort of focus on these particular areas?
Well, the holistic student well-being question came up a lot. And I think the reason for that had to do with, in part, just the title for our strategic planning initiative area. Modernizing the student experience. Experience is a really open-ended phrase, and it really incorporates a lot, right? The student experience, it's not just something that's tied to the classroom. It has to do with their life outside the classroom. It includes, of course, classroom experiences, but what happens after class ends? The student experience includes so much more than that, and so
basically, the students were saying to you, don't just modernize what happens in the classroom. Modernize the whole thing. Like, don't just give me a modern LMS. Give me a modern residential experience. Give me a modern way to address my own mental health, that sort of thing. I mean, that's smart.
Exactly.
The students might be ahead of us in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think, what we try to do with our process is allow students to drive our thinking and drive our brainstorming. And, the students are amazing on campus. They're inspiring leaders. And if you just listen to them, lots and lots and lots of incredible ideas can come forward. And so, yeah, we have a lot of suggested action items from a couple of years ago. And, one of the inspiring things to my mind about this original list from 2 years ago is that many of the things that we recommended are already being set in motion presently, and they're already underway. Yeah. And so, that's I think, something I would emphasize in terms of this dynamic strategic planning process is that it is, yes, of course, about imagining an aspirational otherwise, but it's also about witnessing the ways in which modernizing is already taking place in our midst. And I think, it's easy to kind of feel bummed about the present fiscal climate, and to feel like things are shrinking through attrition, and that by virtue of that shrinking, there are fewer and fewer opportunities. But I think what we try to do with our committee is to recognize that it's precisely because of diminishing state support that actually bold proposals are really especially needed just now. And so we allowed that value to really, unlock some new kind of creative thinking around these questions of what a modern student experience would look like. And it's worked, right? I mean, so we see here in the slide some examples, right, of things that are already going on.
Yeah, and I think, Alex, this is one of the areas where I'm most familiar, I think, maybe with the cutting edge learning opportunities myself, just because this tends to be sort of the area that I work in fairly often in terms of modernizing curriculum and thinking about how technology is incorporated into curriculum and that sort of thing. But when you guys were talking about cutting edge learning opportunities, you opened it up, I think, sort of wider to a wider question of not just learning opportunities in the classroom, but how do we sort of extend outside of the classroom? How do we connect to communities? How do we allow for interdisciplinary, seamless curricular pathways, I think is the particular phrase. But this was, I think, one area, actually all three of these areas, I was actually really surprised to see that we are already doing so much of this. I mean, that's really encouraging. I don't know about you, but it certainly seems like there are a lot of folks on board right now who are willing to make changes. If somebody says, hey, here's an idea, I think people are willing to try things out right now. For sure. So, a couple of the things that I'm familiar with, one would be edX, the Alaska X, the platform on edX. That's kind of an interesting space, I think, to see where we could take transdisciplinary and boundary spanning curriculum in the future. The traditional 4-credit courses, not 4-credit, 4-credit courses, typically in order to change that curriculum, that takes a little bit of a process. And so trying something that's experimental or new in terms of how to deliver curriculum, not just the curriculum content, but how to deliver it, I think is sometimes a hard question to answer when you've got a structure like that. So Alaska X has become sort of this space where the idea of transdisciplinary connections and team teaching and that kind of boundary spanning is deeply embedded to so many of the courses on there. One Health is a great example of that. And Salmon People Place, I think, is another course that's a big example of that. It's not so much that it's on a global platform and has thousands of enrollments at this point, which, that stuff's wonderful. But I think the more important thing that has been fascinating for some people to see is that, like, faculty already think this way at UAF. It's kind of baked into who we are in terms of our identity. Most of the faculty that we work with tend to be boundary spanners intellectually. That's how they tend to approach their classrooms. But it's like this environment around that really needs to change and accommodate more of that boundary spanning. So anyways, those are just my thoughts. Would you say that those are sort of on point, or would you modify any of those ideas?
No, not at all. I think, part of what modernizing the student experience at UAF should look like is just looking for where there are barriers to student success, looking for where there are equity gaps, right? Looking for where there are blockades to kind of, seamless curricular pathways, and just removing those things. People sometimes think, oh, modernize the student experience is going to be so expensive, but it actually it doesn't have to be, right? There are some things that we can do that are free. And a lot of the things that we implemented are incredibly valuable, and yet without cost.
Right. Yeah. So you're actually reminding me of something that we didn't actually put in the slide, the open educational resources efforts that are going on right now for either NOLO, which is no or low cost textbooks, and all the open education resources that faculty are currently developing right now. There are a lot of people who are really thinking, like, how can we lower the textbook costs for students? Which, that just increases access, right? It means that students who would normally say, well, I can't afford all of my textbooks this semester on top of tuition, now they've got a fighting chance if they don't have to pay, thousands of dollars for textbooks on top of everything else. So yeah, there's lots of examples of this across campus. This is such a small smattering. That's one thing that you and I found difficult, I think, was adding in all of the current activities that are actually happening right now. It's a lot going on. One of the things that a lot of folks might not know about are the tech upgrades for rural sites that's going to be rolling out here in the next year. Cal Getter managed to get $750,000 to upgrade a lot of the tech at rural sites, which, in terms of creating a cutting edge, modern learning experience for students, that's always been a challenge in low bandwidth areas, whether they're rural areas or whether it's right here in town and people have trouble accessing the internet. But making sure that that their technology is up to date and that they can actually access the things that they need to access, that's going to be huge in terms of transforming the rural experience for those students. So that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, in my mind, that's a paradigm shift. To introduce those tech upgrades. Something that we thought about a lot and talked about a lot was how do we further integrate the rural campus student experience into the Trothieta student experience, and how can we help these students to cohort with one another and build stronger kind of learning relationships with one another. And I think that the new tech upgrades for the rural sites is sort of the gateway for imagining a new era in which we have a higher level of integration and a higher level of support. The bandwidth issue has just been tremendously challenging, and I'm thrilled to see that some of that is going to be redressed. I mean, it's just a really big deal. And then could you also speak to Canvas? Because I know that this is also an area of passion for you. And certainly I hear a lot of students, and I've heard a lot of faculty and staff for many, many years now complain about Blackboard and some of the other functions that I think Canvas can help to redress.
Yeah, so the LMS space is an interesting space because it actually tends to progress very rapidly. Folks are always coming up with new ways to, build an LMS and think about learning management systems. Like, how do we teach inside of this, sort of technological tool? An institution like UAF is going to have a hard time keeping up with that rate of progression. It's just not possible for any institution, I don't think, really, to keep up with the absolute rapid rate. But, every now and then you do have to sort of look at your LMS and say, is this really facilitating the kind of pedagogical approach that we want to take to education here? And I think Blackboard has sort of maxed out its capacity there. And Canvas, due to, and I won't dig into the details of the interface now, but it really does allow for, it allows for that kind of boundary spanning, engaging, active learning to take place in a way that's not overly burdensome for faculty, and it's not overly burdensome for students either. So there's a pilot that'll be, I should say the pilot's already done, but that's going to be, I think more and more faculty are going to start moving their courses into that next year. And to me, it's really exciting because it's so much easier for students and for faculty to get in there and teach and learn. Both are going to be greatly facilitated by that for sure. And there's nothing that makes you look outdated more than a really old LMS. So I think new students especially are going to appreciate coming into a virtual space anyways, a digital space that's up to date for sure. So let's talk about the environments for holistic well-being. This is an interesting space too. I know a little bit about some of these things, but I think that so let me just address a couple of things in these 4 points here. You guys have got the idea of supporting students with families, which I think is amazing. And this idea of mental, physical, and emotional and spiritual health, like that, thinking of ourselves as whole people, not just as learners or as educators. And then refashioning facilities and providing students with robust degree programs, basically degree and certificate programs. So the support with families, out of all the things that I see sort of happening on campus, things like daycare and support for families in that regard, it feels like we still have a lot of work to do in this particular area. Am I right about that?
You are right about that. And, in particular, the Daycare Center question came up over and over in the conversations that we had, and there was just clearly a need to provide additional resources to non-traditional students, and to, in particular, non-traditional students that have families and that have children. And the idea that we kept hearing expressed was just to have a space on campus where one can have one's children looked after while one goes to class, for example, right? The same way Fred Meyer has a daycare center. While you're shopping, you can leave your kid for an hour and then come back and pick them up. And we didn't have anything like that on campus when we first started this process. And right now, the upper administration is in the process of trying to enact precisely this modernizing feature, which I know will be popular. This is probably this is one of the top 3 things that we heard about the most.
Wow.
In terms of just coming up with a way to more strongly support students with families.
Sure.
The other thing that we heard about a lot that we talked about were the living learning communities. So in terms of modernizing Res Life and some of the resources that Res Life was providing to students, in particular to first-year students who are coming in, was to provide a stronger sense of not just a dorm, but actually a residence hall where community is fostered and supported, and specifically fostered and supported around thematic identities. And so there's already 4 or 5 emergent pilot LLCs. They're no longer pilot LLCs at this point. In 2019, they were pilot LLCs. There's an honors living learning community. There's an engineering living learning community. There's a gender inclusive living learning community. And then there's an outdoor recreation living learning community. And they've been wildly popular. Students, when they're filling out their Res Life applications, if they plan to live on campus, which we know if they can do so, that leads to greater probabilities for student success in terms of them feeling more integrated into campus culture outside of their classroom. And it allows for the kind of creation of further social bonding between students, which we know contributes to student success, right? Those LLCs have been very popular. And as students are filling out their applications, when they see these options, do you want to live in the outdoor recreation, living, learn community? That's really thrilling to students to see that there's already going to be a collective identity waiting for them, right? As they arrive on the shores of UAF, and they can immediately tap into something that they're interested in. It's a big deal. And what we know from research is that the first 6 weeks are crucial in terms of delivering to students a sense of belonging. If you can give them a sense of belonging in the first 6 weeks of their having arrived at UAF, then they're going to feel like they belong throughout their time. And so I just think that the LLCs have really delivered on that. And that's why we talk about sort of expanding the LLC programs and maybe just noticing how well they're working and just further enlarging the impact that they can have on student life.
Right. So, Alex, talk to me a little bit about the makerspace. I mean, some folks might not be familiar with this concept of the makerspace. You've got the Upward Bound and Climate Makerspace here. Are there details that might be interesting?
Yeah, this is an issue area I'm particularly passionate about. So there are, of course, makerspaces all over campus, and there have been for some time. Engineering building has a lot of maker spaces. The art facilities have maker spaces. Maker spaces are any kind of space in which students can access tools required for acts of creation. All right, and to my mind, these have been incredibly underutilized spaces on campus. They are not constellated with one another. Which is a problem. There has been to date not a strong sort of interdisciplinary space where student teams can come and collaborate with one another and brainstorm. There's no makerspace concierge. There's no place where you can go and meet with a staff person or a faculty person and then get dispatched to a particular facility that has a 3D printer or a laser cutter or Raspberry Pi technology, or it just doesn't exist. And so something that we've been working on through Center ICE and OIPC and also with wider groups as well is just how do we further create linkages between these different maker spaces so that we can create greater collaborative energy around providing students with opportunities to make. And again, this is applied to the change agent goal of modernizing the student experience. If part of the goal is to provide students with more active learning opportunities that are tied to problems that exist in the real world, then these makerspaces are sort of like laboratories in which they can do that. They can go and then if the maker spaces are rising to their highest potential, then they're also spaces of integrative learning. They're STEAM spaces, right? I mean, there are maker spaces in the world where you have, in the same space, you have very, very high tech technology, laser cutters, for example, but you also have sewing machines, right? And so the goal has been, to kind of bring these maker spaces on campus together to connect them to curricular pedagogy so that classroom instructors are aware of these spaces and can deploy their students if they want. They can create assignments in their classes where students are deliberately intentionally using these spaces more.
Which is great pedagogy, by the way, allowing students to create something new based on knowledge that they've recently acquired. It's a great way to make sure that they walk away with those ideas, firmly embedded in their approaches. Just the idea of maker spaces in general, I think are pretty exciting.
The Upward Bound Makerspace is new. It's in Duckering. And folks may know about Upward Bound. It's a really important, valuable, exciting program, federal sponsored program that focuses on helping high school students in a variety of communities. At UAF, our Upward Bound program, it works with 10 different communities throughout the state, from Kotzebue to Seward. And the idea is to help those students to graduate from high school, but also to inspire them to matriculate to college. And in particular, they work with students who are first generation students who perhaps might not otherwise be likely to matriculate to college or be likely to graduate from high school. And what they've done is they've created maker spaces in these different communities, and they invite students, these high school students in these different communities, to form research teams. They write mini grants, and specifically the goal is to get them to address problems that they see emergent from within their communities, right? So for example,
awesome.
In Kotzebue, the high school students that were working through Upward Bound, they noticed that their NOAA weather station, I think it got defunded, and yet members of the community still wanted to have reliable weather reports. So they decided to go into the makerspace there. They were working with UAF researchers, but they themselves went into their own makerspace and created weather sensors. And they wrote a grant themselves, high school students, right? Wrote a grant themselves and got their project funded. And now you have reliable weather reports in Kotzebue again, right? So to me, that's sort of high level thinking about what modernizing student experience can look like. And high school students should be cohorting with college students, and our college students should be cohorting with graduate students, and our graduate students should be, right? If you can create peer mentorship around load-bearing problems and active learning, and use a makerspace as a facility through which all of that magic can take place, that's, to me, that's just, high impact,
yeah. It also feels like some of those things are keys to creating lifelong learners too, right? So that thinking of yourself as a learner becomes an integrated part of your identity, rather than thinking, oh, well, I'm done learning once I get my degree. I don't have to think of myself as a learner anymore. I mean, it really seems like students who are able to engage in that kind of, not just that kind of pedagogy, but that kind of mentoring, as you put it, and the connections with many people across, many periods in their life. It just seems like that's a great way to make sure that that's an instilled skill that we teach them. Okay, so the last one here in those three big key points, this idea of creating a culture of innovation, research, and active learning. I'm a huge fan. I really love this idea of not just sort of structural changes taking place at UAF, but that the culture shifts a little bit, and that we start thinking about it ourselves as on the cutting edge of some of these things. So out of all the things that are already happening on campus in this area, is there one that kind of sticks out to you?
Well, all these stand out to me. One Health is a great example of an initiative that is pushing forward a lot of what we're talking about in terms of conducing a culture of innovation, research, and active learning. The Center Ice Startup Weekend, I see Solomon Himmelblum is one of the students there, the student in the hat there. Great student, wonderful active student who epitomizes a lot of, again, what we're talking about here in terms of the way in which he's a UAF student. There's stories that could be told about him, but one kind of example that just comes to mind to me personally is thinking about this this relationship that has formed between Eielson Air Force Base and the Honors College students. So what happened was that the Air Force commander at Eielson Air Force Base, as the F-35 planes were coming in, realized that there were on base out in Salcha, they had a lot of challenges, Arctic environment related, sometimes engineering challenges, sometimes social innovation challenges that were variously associated with the F-35s. And further, he realized that they didn't have an intellectual culture on base for resolving some of those problems. And so he came to the university and asked, the Honors College students, can you form interdisciplinary teams to research and solve some of these problem sets? And, we have started to engage with this. And, it's very exciting stuff. The students are like, they're writing grants, they're forming businesses in some cases.
Wow.
To commercialize the ideas that they are coming up with to redress these, like, kind of in some cases fascinating puzzles, like Rubik's Cube level fascinating puzzles that
Right.
that Eielson has presented students with. That's one example. There's a million other examples, and I know there's stuff going on at eCampus around this, right?
I mean, there's always stuff going on around this at eCampus for sure. I mean, that tends to be something we get very, very excited about for sure. But one space I think that we're always going to have to sort of continue working on, I think, is making sure that innovation, research, and active learning are built into online courses, because you have to be pretty thoughtful about that. And you have to, it requires quite a bit of work actually to embed that into an asynchronous online classroom. And as the number of degree programs that we offer and courses that we offer continue to climb, those asynchronous online courses, like, they have to be really good. They have to allow students to engage in active learning, not just sort of within their class cohort, but they have to, I think, like you're talking about with campus students, making connections with communities, right? So how do you ask students to engage in an assignment where they are engaged with active learning, but they're online and asynchronous? It's actually kind of a complicated problem, but it's a really interesting space for innovation for sure. And then, of course, our instructional design team is always looking at new kinds of technologies that can be incorporated into the teaching and learning process, both on the faculty end and the student end. So definitely. One question that you and I got to, we were sort of thinking about questions that might come up around the forum, the idea of the forum and some of the things that are happening right now. And an interesting conversation we had here was about how do we measure these things? So we want to create students who are boundary spanners and change agents, but how do you measure that? I mean, ultimately, we do have to figure out, like, is this actually happening on campus? So we took a stab at that question. And we talked a little bit about desire paths. So maybe you can sort of dig into what that is a little bit, and then talk about some of these questions that we've got on the bottom of this slide here, and how we might actually sort of figure out whether we're creating boundary standards or not.
Yeah, I love the analogy of the desire path, and listeners who hail from the space committee may recognize this. This idea came from them, really, is that on campus, when the space committee meets to discuss where should a new path be built, what they do is they look for where students are walking, right? Where are students actually forming paths such that you can see where do they want to be, where do they want to go, and then they just build the path there. And we sort of wondered about how can you think about that metaphor as applying not only to the construction of pathways literal pathways on campus, but then how can we think about it as being applied more broadly to other areas of student life? I think, just looking at some of these ideas in terms of measuring boundary spanning, they're tied to this desired pathway analogy. And this is sort of, right where we are in our process. So these ideas aren't yet settled at all. We're brainstorming this right now. How can we connect the strategic plan to accreditation? The answer to that is figuring out where the metrics are for measuring success. How do you quantify change agency? How do you quantify boundary spanning? And some ideas that have emerged in the conversations that you and I have had, I think are kind of interesting. For instance, something that I'm noticing is more and more and more interdisciplinary degrees are being engaged in by students. And my friend John Smelter, who is the director of interdisciplinary learning, I'm not sure that title's exactly right, but he's in charge of coordinating the process whereby a student who wants to make their own degree program, he coordinates that whole process for them. And he, according to what he tells me, the number of students who are interested in doing that, which is to say, creating their own degree program that kind of slides in between all of the many options that we provide, is increasing like tenfold every year. Okay, so that's a sign that students are more and more interested in becoming boundary spanners themselves. I mean, they're literally boundary spanning, right? I have been in a number of interdisciplinary degree-seeking students faculty committees. And in particular, I'm noticing lots and lots of interest among students in graduating with a degree in some kind of ecological resilience or social innovation tied to ecological resilience in the state of Alaska or throughout the circumpolar north or in the Arctic. Lots and lots of students want to do that and don't feel like that issue area is specifically addressed by any particular major or not well enough. And so they're, I think that those students, the work that they're doing in terms of the degrees that they're creating is actually an opportunity for us to do some desire path creation where we can build bridges between some of the traditional disciplines because that's where students are already. Yeah, but there's
I can tell you that there are a lot of new degree programs in process right now. They're being built. The curriculum's being constructed, and I'm part of a small team of people who it's the academic incubator. But the idea is that, like, if folks really want to come up with some of these more official, so rather than having students map their own pathway, how do we actually create degrees that respond to that kind of boundary spanning interdisciplinarity? But getting a degree program through the approval process within an institution is not that easy. It's not that fast. And so we're trying to support a more rapid progression through that process so that we're capturing those students before they go to another university that might be offering a degree in climate resilience and things like that way ahead of us. So hopefully this is going to allow us to, get these faculty together to create these new degree and certificate programs that really do respond to what students are asking for. And I know that there's a lot of collaboration that happens with the recruiters too. Listening to the recruiters and asking them, what are students asking you about? What are they telling you they want? And hearing from the recruiters, I think, has been a fascinating process too, because you start to realize that, our degrees are rather siloed compared to the types of boundary spanning things that students are really asking for. So yeah, that I'm just sort of now having this thought that the idea of boundary spanning is maybe more sort of built into our students than we think it is. And it's our system that's having a hard time responding to that desire to span boundaries. Maybe that's a natural human inclination to sort of put two new things together and remix and see what happens. But, when you've got a large structure like this, a complicated piece of machinery, it doesn't always respond to that very quickly. So I think we're learning how to respond to that.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I was just quickly, I was just going to say, we have this in the Modernize the Student Experience 2-pager, but we talk about some of the challenges that perhaps UAF could overcome in order to facilitate a modernization process for students. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is compartmentalized knowledge production, and the solution to de-siloing some of that compartmentalization is institutional agility, right? And so the question is, how do we foster greater institutional agility? And we already have examples. You're pointing them out. We have examples. The academic incubator and accelerator. Those are examples where the process is being streamlined such that new, creative, exciting, important new ideas can come to fruition. It's not going to take 2 years to make something good happen, right? That's necessary.
So I think maybe point out that these questions down here are really they were some ideas that you and I threw out. These are not official questions, these are not official measurements basically, but we were just trying to think how could we actually measure something like that. So those aren't in any way official, nor are what follows here. But I think this is another interesting question that you and I have talked a lot about, how do you measure change agency? And change agency, I think it's easy to measure change, but change agency, what does that really mean? And you guys had some interesting stuff in the materials from the previous year's work on this, but the idea that students are empowered, that they have the agency, they have the freedom, they have the power to make the kinds of changes that they really want to make. And the questions that are along the bottom here, maybe some of the more provocative questions that you and I were asking. They're not, measuring anything official, but we were just sort of playing with the idea. And this first one is kind of interesting because this question, I think, applies to both students, staff, and faculty. Are you getting in the good kind of trouble? Have you been asked, is this within the scope of your job or major lately? That question is probably going to make people a little bit nervous, I think. But I mean, why is that a sign of change agency? Like, how do you see that relationship between this question and the idea of change agency?
Yeah, and that "are you getting in the good kind of trouble" is that's a quote from John Lewis, and this was sort of his idea, is that it's incumbent upon us to kind of summon the moral courage to stand up for what's right, and to do so in a way that sometimes includes bucking against social norms, if those social norms are sedimented, and if they are inequitable and generators of inequality, then maybe it's the right kind of trouble to get in. That's a possibility. One sign of change agency, one site for, I think, measuring change agency, to my mind, is to look at, for instance, the types of capstone projects that students are submitting. What I'm noticing is that over time, across a variety of colleges and majors and departments, students are getting more and more creative with what their capstone projects look like. And I think, for instance, of Casey Casort, who she created her own major, and it was an environmental resilience kind of a major. And her capstone project was to intern in a legislative office in Juneau, and to actually write a law that was passed by the legislature on the subject of telehealth and the impact that climate change is having on telehealth, and vice versa.
That's
and
amazing.
so to me, there's like an example, right, of actually doing something, right, as opposed to submitting a traditional thesis that then sits on a dusty library shelf. She actually went out and fomented the change she wanted to see in the world. And she didn't get into any trouble. I mean, she had to be strategic and thoughtful in the way that she worked with other legislators and other staffers in Juneau in order to ensure that this law was passed into being. But to me, there's one example, and there's a million others of amazing things that students are doing to change their state community or their more local community. I have another student who, for instance, for her capstone project, she's a biology major and also a French major, and she's just graduating right now. And she's also a climate scholar. And her capstone project was to actually get assigned to serve the borough climate action group that was assembled. And she's the only student, right? It's a lot of faculty researchers and community activists that are on that board, and they're charged with coming up with a climate action plan for the North Star Borough, and we have a student there, right? So there's another example of change agency, and if we could do a better job of just counting, looking qualitatively at what kinds of capstone projects students are submitting, and just counting, the looking at a way of quantifying the impact that's having. That would be.
I was in a conversation recently where somebody sort of posed the question of, how often are graduate students doing more and going beyond just putting their thesis basically on a library shelf? And how are we as an institution facilitating them going beyond that, right? So how can we facilitate students taking their graduate work out into the real world and doing something even more with it and getting visibility on those things, which is really hard these days. In some ways it's easier, but in some ways it's much, much harder. There's so much noise and information out there. The question here in the middle is shared governance being used to facilitate adaptive change or prevent it. The students, as part of the shared governance structure, how do you think students are doing right now? And how can we as an institution sort of facilitate them using their role in shared governance to push the boundaries or make changes or ask questions?
It's a really complicated question. I think the value of shared governance is tremendously important. We have to democratize decision making. We have to invite input in order to maximize people's sense of belongingness and ownership over decisions that are being made, that in turn affect them. That's really important. But then how do we optimize a process that is inclusive of shared governance, but at the same time institutionally agile? You don't want inclusivity to be the enemy of innovation. So to me, that's
you also just don't want to innovate for the sake of innovation, right? I mean, I think this is really a difficult challenge to balance between the two. I mean, just trying something new for the sake of trying something new, I mean, that gets us into trouble, right? Because then you have to go back and revisit, everything all over again a year later. And I don't think any of us really have the time or the energy to do things like that. But yeah, I mean, how do you create that kind of agility, adopt that kind of agility, and allow this institution to respond to new challenges, but still be inclusive? And that's a hard thing to answer. And I think it's going to take a lot of players being very conscious of that tension to really succeed in this space. We've touched a little bit already on the idea of a major no longer fitting what a student wants to do. So I don't think we need to spend too much time on that one. But this is also, I think, another sort of institutional question that you and I have talked about in relationship to this goal. And this is largely a question that, has been, it was asked in the forums in a couple of different ways. And I think all of us have, as part of the institution, have had this question at one point or another. Like, how are we supposed to innovate and do all these new things when our resources are just, I mean, we're losing them by the day. I mean, people are leaving, money is leaving. It's a really challenging environment. And I think this question at the top here: how do you have shrinking capacity and growing innovation at the same time? So how would you respond to that, Alex?
Well, as I said before, I think it's important just to recognize that it is precisely because of diminishing state support, diminishing, the present fiscal climate, that bold and innovative proposals are especially important and needed right now. I also think it's important to allow our process for strategic planning to be animated primarily by its regard for what modernizing the student experience objectively requires. Like we shouldn't start with, in light of shrinking capacity, what is possible. We should just figure out what needs to happen, and then ask the next question, which is, how can we organize resources for that preferred future, and what will it take to set it in motion, and how do we get creative about working together in more efficient ways? I mean, as difficult and challenging the last couple of years have been, I also think that what I've noticed is that there's increased energy and interest around finding collaborative opportunities. And I think that can only be good.
Big time.
Yeah, I think that can only be good.
Yeah.
Right? And, the example I give is at Harvard, right now, for the last couple of years, they've been investing in a $10 million staircase that is architecturally designed to encourage people who wouldn't otherwise meet one another to do so. And I think it's sort of a double helix structure. Okay. And so I don't know how it works, but basically they're investing a lot of money in the creation of what I would call a contact zone. But actually, you don't need to invest $10 million in order to get a contact zone. You don't need to do that. And, so the question is, what can we do to kind of support collaborative relationships forming that are going to be efficient? And that's always a good question to ask. And It's always a good solution from the perspective of growing innovation. So I think that's where we're at. Yeah. But I love your metaphors here. Could you explain your metaphors the stew and the quilts, and it's so cool.
Well, so, I mean, this is, I think, a question, I mean, just due to the role that I have, this question comes up a lot. Like, how do you innovate when you don't have a lot of resources? And I think there's plenty of examples throughout history and different areas of life that we can look at to see that it doesn't take money to innovate. And as a matter of fact, it's often when we're out of resources that we come up with the most innovative solutions to our problems. And I think an example of that, so like a quilt is really just leveraging existing resources that are no longer useful for one purpose and leveraging them to do something else. So you take these old clothes that have busted out knees and a tear in the sleeve, and you cut them up and you reshape them into a quilt, which is incredibly useful, but it's a totally different purpose. Kintsugi is a Japanese art where you take broken pottery and it's a really old craft of putting it back together with a special compound that has gold in it. And it's done in such a way that the resulting structure is actually sometimes even stronger than the original due to the nature of the reinforcements. And then Brunswick stew, I'm from the South originally, even though you can't hear my accent most of the time. But Brunswick stew is really, the recipe is based on taking leftovers out of your fridge and reusing them to make a really good soup. And I know a lot of folks here in Fairbanks use their old, you take the lettuce off the head and you stick the leftover, I don't know what that core is called, but you take that core and stick it in the ground and it's going to grow back, Yeah. And I just think these are really good examples of the ways in which people are innovating right now on campus. A lot of the things that you and I have been talking about here, these are not activities that are arising out of new funding necessarily. Some of these things are being done with existing or pre-existing resources and materials and ideas, and those things might not be useful anymore. So we're taking them and reforming them into something new, because that's sort of the only option we've got right now. Yeah. I think that this might be our last slide, Alex. I have a suggestion here that if folks want to get on board any of these projects, or if we skipped something big that maybe you think we might not be aware of, that contact one of us, and we'll make sure that we're serving as those boundary spanners who can connect people across campus, and leverage that type of collaboration even further. So before we close up, though, is there anything that you would want to add to this conversation that we've sort of missed here?
I would just add that, to my mind, UAF is a really strong institution that bears exciting and in some cases unparalleled opportunities for students. In particular, by virtue of its highly favorable faculty to student ratios, UAF provides a kind of liberal arts college level educational experience that is uniquely complemented by the resources that are available at a near tier 1 research institute. And I don't want the kind of some of the things that we've said over the course of the last hour to suggest that we're not already a pretty impressive place. I'm constantly impressed by my colleagues and in particular by the students that I'm so fortunate to work with. I do, however, think that it is right always to wonder, how can we do even better? How can we get better? How can we modernize? How can we be at the cutting edge? What would that look like? And I just think that this process is, if nothing else, an invitation for folks all over campus, all over the rural campuses, all over the community, to kind of weigh in on what they think needs to happen, and not just to kind of raise questions about problems that they see in their midst, but actually to propose solutions and for us to work together and think together.
Yeah, and to be part of the solution, yes. Join us, become part of some of these processes. Yes,
and I think now. The leadership on campus has stabilized in a way that presents an opportunity really for a robust form of support for really good ideas that are coming forward and emerging for those ideas to become catalysts for modernization on campus. So I love this last slide. This isn't just Alex and Madera working on this. We're looking for partners.
Oh God, no.
Partnership.
Please.
We're looking
so
for
many people already doing this. Yeah. And there's plenty of them out there. We could have Peter Webley in here. We could have Sarah Stanley in here. There's lots of folks we could invite into this conversation who we know are already sort of highly collaborative and boundary spanners themselves. But yeah, I mean, we're certainly two contact points that can help you connect to other people and know more about sort of what's happening in this area. Because, boy, that's not an easy thing to figure out sometimes. It's really hard to know what's happening at this university sometimes. There's so much going on. It's a big place. There's a lot of people involved and a lot of things involved, a lot of stakeholders. So yes. I'm proud and happy to be part of the process. And I really do appreciate you inviting me into it at this phase. This is the fun part, in my opinion. You already did all the hard work along with the other committee members. So it's really fun to be part of this now. Without any further ado, thanks for joining us, folks. And we look forward to working with you.
Yeah, thanks everyone for your time. And please do feel free to reach out